In this part of the world, we are going into summer right now, so it's time to make some lagers. I've been getting a lot of questions lately, so let's go through a few things. Anyone that's been watching this channel or my live streams for the last couple of years know my favourite lager is Rat and Hund from Hop Nation. I've already done a video on how to brew that. It's quite a long process, but you need to do that to get the quality at the end. Don't be shortening the mash. Don't be shortening the boil. We could speed up the aging or lagering a little bit. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's two other recipes that I think are good. There's the VB clone I made for my mate Dave. There's a whole video on that already. And the other one is Beefer's 4X Gold. I haven't got the video out for that yet, but the recipe, there'll be a link below. That's a really good 3.5% lawnmower lager. I can briefly talk about recipes. I like nearly 100% Pilsner malt in my lagers, keep it nice and light. Some people like to add carapils just to help with head retention. You don't always need that, but it does help. I prefer noble hops, the Halito varieties, something like that, SARS if you like it, and that's about it. Lagers were always known to be really hard to brew, and it wasn't just about the temperature. Lagers you have to ferment at a lower temperature for them to turn out really nice. It was all about them being, well, the original smash beer. One grain and one hop, and that left nowhere to hide. Your mistakes are obvious. That's what always confuses me when a beginner brewer says, what should my first recipe be? And someone says a smash beer. They're really hard to balance out. Beginners, stay away from smash beers. Do them later when you've got your system dialed in and you know how to balance a beer. So the ingredients are fairly basic. Even the water, you want mostly everything pretty low to get a nice traditional lager. I'm lucky here in Melbourne, there's not much of anything in our water, so I don't even really need to filter it. I do remove the chlorine and chloramine, but I don't need a filter for that. I do like to add some magnesium and some calcium just to help the yeast out. Yeast health is very important in lagers. And for me, that's more important than trying to keep everything really low in the water profile. Because I only use one malt, I like to do a decoction. You don't have to do a multi-stepped mash or anything like that. You can just leave the decoction for the mash out. That way you don't have to be so critical about the amount of malt and liquid you take out of your wort to give it a little bit of a boil on the side, because you're just looking for mash out temps when you add that fluid back into your grain. Whereas when you're trying to do those big multi-step mashes, you're trying to hit certain temperatures, and that makes it a bit harder. So just do one decoction for your mash out. I find the decoction will add a little bit of complexity to the malt, a slightest touch of sweetness, a little bit more colour, and flavours you just can't get from adding other malts. A nice long boil always helps. Really, 90 minutes is a good place to start. The Rat and Hund, that goes for 105 minutes. Shortening boils is not a good idea for these beers. So a single Pilsner malt is fine. You can add a little bit of carapils for head retention, a noble hop like the Halitos or the SARS, Saz, and a water profile with nice low salts. And then there's the yeast. The yeast can make a massive difference and does for lagers. I was watching a pro brewer the other day on YouTube, and he said that lager yeast doesn't matter because you can't taste it, it should be clean. And that's just not right at all. Some lager beers are that light in malt that if they don't have that yeast characteristic, there's not much going on in the beer. We all have personal favourites for lager yeast. A lot of people like to use 3470 or the Diamond lager yeast. I'm not a huge fan of the Diamond lager yeast. I know a lot of people are. I'd rather the 3470 over that. That's just personal taste. And of course there's a whole heap of classic European liquid lager yeasts. But here right now they're getting very expensive and you've got to make a huge starter. So the starter will bring us to how much yeast we should use. If you're making a starter, you really want a good 4 litre, 5 litre starter. And because of that amount, what you want to do is ferment that out early, then put it in the fridge so all that yeast sinks to the bottom, and then you can decant or get rid of that 4 litres, 4 or 5 litres of liquid on top. Otherwise, that all goes into your brew. And if you're only brewing, you know, a single 5 gallon or 6 gallon, 22, 23 litre batch, then that 5 litres is going to make a huge difference to your beer. And of course, that takes a lot of preparation and timing. And if you're using dry yeast, which is perfectly fine, you really want at least 2 packets, even 3 is better, or 4. People always say, I am going overboard. I'll just show you this pack, S23, Sapphire. And it says if you're pitching at room temperature, which most people don't do for lagers, but we'll get back to that in a second, 1 packet in 10 to 15 litres. And if you're pitching at 11 to 15 degrees Celsius, which is recommended, you should use 2 packets, but that's in 10 to 15 litres. The companies don't do this to rip you off, they do it so your beer turns out nice. So you do the math there, and when you're doing, 23 or 26 gallon batch, that's why I say 3 or 4 packs. Now, if you are a bit skint, and I agree, yeast is expensive sometimes, the reason it says room temperature there isn't just because you're going to brew it under pressure or anything. You can start it a little bit warmer. You can put your lager yeast in at 20 degrees, say, but you need to keep an eye on it, because as soon as you see action start to happen, which is hard to spot in lager yeast sometimes, because it's not always on top, it ferments down the bottom. It might be 6 hours. Then you want to turn it down to your lager fermenting temperatures. What that does, that warmth at the start just gives that yeast a little bit of a kick-off. Don't skimp on the yeast. What you might have seen me do in a few videos, if I want to make like a special competition lager that I want lovely or for Christmas or something, I might brew a batch first using just 2 packets of yeast. Brew that goes into the back of the fridge for aging and as a house lager. And then I use that whole yeast cake to brew another batch, and that'll be the one I use in a competition or give to my family and friends. So I make 1 batch as a starter. Of course, the new boy in town is Nova Lager, and I've been using that lately. It's in my latest Mexican beer, and it's awesome. You don't get all those classic European yeast lager flavours, but it still ferments as a really nice lager yeast. If it's a lawnmower beer, say it's around 4.5%, you can use 1 pack of Nova Lager, pitch it at about 15 degrees, and that'll ferment out in a week. After 3 or 4 days, once your gravity gets down to like 1.025, start bumping it. You can bump it up to 16 or 18 degrees, and then after a day or two again, up to 20 degrees, and that'll finish off nice and clean. It doesn't throw any sulfur or any off aromas at all. Because of that, it doesn't need a long lagering time at all. And if you use something like Biofine, which we'll go about again in a minute, you can have that beer clear in a matter of days and drinking it under 2 weeks easy for a nice lager from pitching the yeast to drinking it. And if you don't believe me, you need to try it. But because it's so clean, it's not the yeast for every beer, but personal taste again. If you haven't got access to Nova Lager, you could try using a Kolsch. Technically it's ale yeast, but you can ferment that quite low and nice and clean like a lager yeast if you go in about 15 degrees. And again, you can raise that up just like you do Nova Lager fast. Watch it though, because if you ferment it too warm, it will throw some fruity flavours out there. And of course, the elephant in the room, the lagering period, the actual lagering. Now the lagering is just keeping it at a nice cold temperature in the fridge, really cold, so it can clear out. And when that yeast clears out, that gets rid of a lot of the sulfur and off flavours that aren't so good that come with lager yeasts, some lager yeasts. But that's where products like Biofine, some people use gelatin, I'd much prefer to use Biofine. You don't have to mess around with it. It doesn't stink like gelatin does, but you can use gelatin if that's what you prefer. But a product like Biofine or gelatin will just pull out that yeast quickly, and that shortens lagering immensely. Biofine, by the way, is allowed under the purity laws, if that really makes a difference to you. There is no set time for lagering. Some people will say, oh, you must lager for a month, or you must lager for 3 months. Some people will even say 6 months, and that is absolutely ridiculous. There is no set time for lagering. The set time for lagering is for you when it tastes good. Even for the professional brewer, it's when it tastes good. And you can lager too long. So you mightn't have tasted it. Say you've left it for 3 months. It might have been good at 1 month, and by 3 months it's dropped off. So what I suggest, if you don't want to use a Biofine, is just test it. Test it every couple of weeks. And once you think it's nice, go for it. Some people will say it's always the last glass of a keg that tastes the best. One of the reasons for that is that's because they're clear. The yeast is gone. And that's where Biofine, things like that, really help, because you get rid of that first. Yeast isn't much good in most beers, not even your NIPAs. You don't want that haze to be yeast. So if you're in a hurry, Biofine, gelatin will really help with the lagering, or use something like Nova Lager that just doesn't produce those off flavours to start with. Even still, I'd use Biofine if you want to drink a Nova Lager beer in a hurry, just to help it clear. Get that yeast out of it. Oh, I guess we should touch on the pressure fermenting. I don't really push temperatures and pressures to make my beers come out clean. I don't think you need to these days. Maybe change yeast. If you have to, if you live somewhere warm, you don't have temperature control, you know, that's really hard to brew a nice clean lager without it. Yes, but you need to use high pressures. And when I'm saying high pressures, you want to be up over the 15 psi, up over 1 bar, even closer to 2 bar, which, you know, I don't suggest people doing in their fermentosauruses and things like that, their Firmzillas. You've got to make sure you've cleaned your PRV valve, your pressure relief valve, and your spunding valve. Make sure it's clean, because if it blocks, it only take, you know, half an hour, 10 minutes at those pressures for something to blow. I know the sticker on the side says 30 psi, but, you know, all it takes, as I said, is one little blockage somewhere, something stuck, and you're over that 30 psi, the 2 bar, and then you're in danger territory. People know I use a lot of conicals lately. Most of the stainless steel conicals, they're only rated to 15 psi anyway. So my suggestion is, if you do want to rush it along a little bit, make sure you still use, you know, at least 2 packets of yeast. Ride on this high spot of the recommended temperature. Don't be going over it if you can, by any possibility. Don't be going over it by like 10 degrees. Just ride on that high spot of the recommended temperature, and it'll ferment out a lot quicker. And the pressure will help with some of the off flavors, off esters that get produced at high temperatures. If you haven't got any temperature control at all, get some. Get an old fridge. No, it's really, it's one of the most important things in the whole of brewing is temperature control of ferments. I should mention Kveik yeasts. I'm not a fan, especially in something like a lager. I don't find any of them clean enough. That's my taste thing. People tell me Lutra's clean the time. I've tried it a couple of times. I've used it once. I've tasted mates' beers with it. They're okay, but I can always taste that dusty Kveik thing in the background. But of course, if you don't get that dusty thing off it, use it. There's way too many lagers to go through here, from Vienna lagers to darker lagers, amber lagers, all sorts. But what's popular here, for some reason in Australia this year, is Mexican lager. Cervesa, some people might call them. All the breweries seem to be brewing it. I'm not sure if I missed something. Maybe they're trying to make it the flavour of the month or something like that. But if you look around this summer in Australia, you'll see Mexican lagers in all the breweries. What makes a Mexican lager different? For me, it's corn. I see some people use rice for Mexican lagers, and I don't think you get that sweet flavour and corn flavour you get when you usually have a Mexican style lager. I have a Mexican lager video coming out very soon. I used polenta for that. You can get it at the supermarket. So again, all you would need is Pilsner malt and some polenta and a noble hop. And I use Nova lager yeast in it. This is my Mexican lager. I'm not sure how it's going to look in front of the green screen. And that corn, that just adds it. To me, that makes a Mexican lager. Cheers. The video for the Mexican lager will be out soon, but the recipe is already down below. And for the Patreons watching, there is a long cut brew day of the Mexican beer already up if you haven't seen it. It's a long one though, I think it goes for an hour. Talking about the rice, I'd leave rice for like the Japanese style lagers and American light lagers. In a single batch, you might swap out anywhere from 500 grams to a kilo, and that's what, 1 pound to 2 pound, even 3 pound, I guess, in some recipes. Again, personal taste, and you'll find after brewing it a few times where you like that sweet spot. I think that'll do it. Thanks for sticking with me. I am in front of the green screen because my brewery flooded again, so I'm inside. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Let me know what your favourite lager recipe is, please, in the comments below. If you have any tips for anybody else, if you have any more questions, please don't be afraid to ask. Please check out my Patreon. There is a free tier. There isn't much on there for the free tier at the moment, but I'll try and change that. I might open up some of the really old videos. There is a good few hundred videos on my Patreon. There's probably, my Patreon videos have nearly equaled what's on my whole channel I've done over these many years. I think I started back in 2007 or something like that. They won't be of the same quality that this is, but there is a lot of videos on there if you're interested in becoming a patron. And if you're a paid patron, you'll get your name on the screen eventually. Big thanks to these guys.